I'm Greg Anders. I'm the Executive Director of the Heritage Flight Museum. We are based at Skagit Airport north of Seattle. heritageflight.org is our URL. And I get the privilege of flying here this weekend with Val-Halla, our P-51D. Well, our paint scheme is derived from my father's Air Force career. His first assignment was flying with this fighter squadron, the 57th Fighter Squadron, up in Iceland, Reykjavik, Iceland, flying F-89s up there. So he flew there in F-89s. The squadron started with P-51s. It was the Reno Guard that deployed to Iceland to start that squadron. So we managed to tell that story. He didn't have good pictures of the paint scheme back then, but as it turns out, he matched the F-89 paint scheme, and we got pictures later of the P-51, and he got it correct. So that was pretty exciting to get that validation. So this is a post-World War II paint scheme of P-51. Not very many paint schemes out there of that in that era. Mostly they're World War II, which is appropriate. It's got my dad's name on it, Major General Bill Anders. My dad was part of the Apollo 8 crew in 1968. Got into flying in the 90s and got the P-51 and started our museum around it. So I have the privilege of running our museum, and he's still flying. He's flying T-34s at almost 88 and doing a great job with it. So Val-Halla is the paint scheme that we put on there. Valerie is the name of my mother, so Val-Halla is Viking heaven. And so that's where the name comes from, and that's where the paint scheme comes from. Well, when I do the pre-flight on the P-51, I start where I want to finish, and this is how I get up into the cockpit. So I start here at the left tire. I'll usually have the chocks in here if we're going to go fly. Main thing that we're checking within the wheel well, there's a gear trunnion up in here. I want to make sure that's good and solid because that will sequence the gear down and bring the gear down. The light just kind of flops in there and gets banged up by the door, and that's how that works. I check for a little residual pressure. I look in it, I'll make sure all the hoses are clean and the radiator intake is clear. Then I knock on my plane, make sure everybody's home, and I don't hear too many Zeus fasteners rattling. We check the prop as we go by, and we make sure the intake, this is the intake for the carburetor right here, so we make sure that's clear. Especially in the air show environment, you want to make sure somebody didn't put something in there. Check the prop as we go around. Again, we're knocking for loose Zeus. These little fasteners will rattle when you knock on the frames to make sure that none are loose. We check for our residual hydraulic pressure up in here. We check for any fluids, check the light, make sure it's good. The main thing I'm looking for is my connecting rod up in there for the gear, make sure tires and brakes are good, and then just look at overall condition of the airframe. Pitot tube is down in here, so we make sure that's clear. We've got a volunteer at our museum that does a great job of cleaning, so this plane is always super clean. She's on the road right now and got a few bug smashes, but not many. Check the ailerons, or the flight controls are locked right now, as they always will be for towing the airplane, and so they're locked like that. We just check that, make sure they're good, checking the flaps. One of the most critical things is to make sure that our latches for the ammunition bay and the gun bays are latched down. We don't want to make sure we don't have any issues with that popping up in flight. Check the fuel cap. One of the best ways to see the soul of the Mustang and make sure she doesn't have any issues is to look through this hole here. If you get in real close, you can see a little tray in there where there's, you can see if something were leaking, there's a good chance that's where it would show up. So that's one of my favorite places to look, and most important places for me to look to make sure my airplane is healthy. We have a unique kind of thing on our airframe. This was done to draw heat out. It's not a North American modification, it's a civilian modification to allow that heat to escape. Not too many airplanes are doing it anymore, but it does get some of the heat out. If we were to rebuild this panel again, which we just did actually, I'd probably leave the gills off there and not worry about it too much. So the oil cooler's down underneath, the radiator's here, my patented sort of frog squat to get down in here, using my elbows, make sure everything's clear, check the gear, and check the oil radiator doors. So there's basically 3 radiators in there and 2 radiator blocks. There's an oil cooler and then a coolant for the engine and after cooler for once the air gets compressed and fuel mixed in it, it goes into the engine. And so the after cooler then cools that off so you don't have detonation when you get in there. So we check the elevators back here. Check the trim tabs, make sure they're good and solid, connectors are good and are castellated, have got their cotter pins in there, rudder trim in the rudder, just making sure we're in good shape and condition. Same back here, so I haven't done the trim to take off trim yet. I can tell by it being off just a little bit. That trim gets that nose up for the landing, so it gets pretty aggressive. For a good landing, you want about 10 degrees nose up on the trim at least. And so I can tell if I've trimmed properly on my last landing when I go to fix that. Neutral trim on the elevator for takeoff. Then basically here, pitot-static tube, just making sure our port is clear. Make sure our door is closed. Give that a little thump to make sure the paint lines up and we don't get the door popping open. Once again, our gills here are a little unique. They draw that heat out of there. Again, probably something we wouldn't do if we redid this. Checking the flaps again, make sure we're good. Aileron with the trim tab, make sure she's good. And then wingtips, checking lights, make sure we're all solid on that. And then back around to the beginning where it's time for me to make sure chocks are either out or my crew chief's ready to pull the chocks. And up we go to fly. All right, so the cockpit pre-flight is kind of, I like to use a flow type of style of cockpit check. I will follow a checklist every now and then to make sure I'm getting my flow correct, but mostly I'm running through this and making sure that we're good to go. So on the deep corner back here in the back is the flaps. I'll make sure they're up for takeoff. Way back in there, a very inconvenient spot for reaching them, but we get them. Not a super authentic cockpit, but this section of the cockpit is very authentic. The cockpit up here was done in the mid-80s, at a time when people were kind of flying these as corporate planes. So throttle gets a little bit of a crack, mixture stays off, props full forward. I check my trims here. Run the nose trim, or the elevator trim to 0. Rudder trim to 6. Take care of that P factor and all that stuff on takeoff. Run through the instruments. I got the fuel boost on. I'll get the radios to come on. We pre-oil for about 2 minutes before we even start the engine. I'll close up my radiator doors to make sure that those are working good and to help warm up a little bit. So we get a little bit of fuel. We give about 9 seconds of the primer on the fuel. Hit the starter on and then the mag switch will come on here. Plane starts up very quickly usually. It's very easy to start usually. Once it gets hot, you get to be a bit of a challenge. Very easy to flutter, end up with a stack fire when the aircraft is hot. So much nicer to fly her when she's cold. Canopy. It's got our little phenolic lock there. It locks these into these tracks here so that when you can close it, you can pick these things, and that's how that works. That's really about it on the interior pre-flight real quick. We just make sure we're on the right tank for whichever tank we're using for this. For an air show, I'll leave a little bit of fuel out of the left tank, top the right tank off because of the way the prop pushes that wing down on the left side. It helps to have a little more weight on the right side. So that's really about it.